Night on the frontier of Europe, and the world is moving. Torches bob along distant roads like scattered stars brought down to earth. Hooves beat against frozen ground. Wheels creak. Musket barrels flash dully when lightning storms cross the sky. Far away in the darkness, 1,000 boots sink into mud in unison. The sound, a low, endless murmur that rises and falls with the wind. Armies are shifting, not in clumsy lines, but in living currents, invisible to one another, converging and diverging like tides. At the center of this restless map, one mind reads the land as if it were a vast board. Every ridge and river a line of force, every crossroad a nerve. In an age when most generals still think of war as a matter of placing troops and then waiting for the clash, he thinks of war as pure movement, as speed and angle and the precise choice of where and when to apply the weight of an army. This is the world of Napoleon Bonaparte, and his true genius is not only in fire and steel, but in the way he moves men across the face of continents. From the first campaigns of his youth to the last desperate marches of his fall, Napoleon treats time and distance as weapons. Where others see obstacles, he sees opportunities. Where others are content to wait for the enemy to make a mistake, he creates their mistakes by the way he maneuvers. He is a mathematician of roads and rivers, a dramatist of marches, a sculptor of space. He understands that if an army can arrive unseen where it is least expected, if it can stand between divided foes, if it can assemble out of long columns into a single crushing mass at the chosen point, then the battle is often decided before the first cannon fires. This instinct does not appear out of nowhere. It is shaped first in the tight valleys and rugged hills of northern Italy, where the young general is sent to command a shabby, undersupplied French army during the Revolutionary Wars. The enemy is the Austrian monarchy, heavy with tradition, rich in resources, used to fighting slow set-piece campaigns that revolve around strong fortresses and carefully prepared positions. Their generals think in straight lines and rigid phases. Napoleon arrives with a different spirit. He travels with maps, studies the rivers and passes, calculates how long it will take each of his divisions to march from one point to another. The Italian theater is not spacious. It is narrow and broken, with mountain chains and winding roads that separate Austrian columns from each other. In this fragmented landscape, he discovers the power of what later generations will call the central position. The idea is simple to describe and frightening in execution. Instead of facing all enemy forces at once, he seeks to place his army between them so that they are trapped on separate sides of his own line of movement. He uses the interior lines of the theater, the shorter routes inside the arc of enemy positions, to move more quickly than they can. At Montenotte and Millesimo, at Dego, and later at Castiglione, he throws his weight first against one part of the Austrian deployment, then wheels around to hit another before they have time to unite. His troops march hard, sleep little, and fight often, but they are rewarded with victories that seem almost miraculous in the face of superior numbers. The soldiers may not know the geometry of central position, but they feel its effects when they stand alone against an enemy who expected help from another column that never arrives. The central position is not only a trick of Rhodes, it demands nerve. To place an army between enemy forces is to invite disaster if timing fails. The general must be absolutely sure that the part he chooses to strike first can be beaten before the other arrives. Napoleon accepts this risk again and again because he trusts his speed, his intelligence network, and the endurance of his men. He knows that if he can maintain the initiative, if he can keep the enemy reacting to his thrusts and feints, he can stretch out their decision cycles and rob them of the unity that is their only real strength. Years later, when his power has grown and he commands not a single field army, but something like a nation in arms, he uses the central position on an even more enormous scale. In 1805, coalitions form around Austria and Russia, determined to crush the upstart French Empire. The Austrian general Mack plants his forces around Ulm on the Danube, expecting to face a direct French advance from the west. Instead, Napoleon swings his Grande Armée in a vast arc, crossing the Rhine far to the north, then turning southeast through the valleys of southern Germany. He places his army between Mack and his Russian allies, rear and flank both within reach. Using interior lines, he blocks all exits. Columns of French troops flow past each other along converging roads, drummers beating the march, officers riding ahead to secure bridges and crossings. Within a short span, the Austrian army at Ulm is surrounded. There is no great open battle, only a series of fast moves that end in capitulation. An entire army disappears from the war with minimal French blood spilled, and the coalition is sundered before it can truly take shape. The central position returns again and again in the last act of his career, when the tide of fortune is already turning against him. In the campaign of 1814, the armies of Europe pour into France itself, from east and north and southeast, a flood of vengeance finally reaching the heart of the empire. Napoleon no longer commands the vast numbers he once did. His conscripts are younger, his veterans fewer, his resources strained. Yet the geography of his homeland offers one last gift. Rivers, hills, and roads in the heart of France lend themselves to a desperate kind of interior maneuver. Against multiple invading armies that are poorly coordinated and slowed by their own baggage and caution, Napoleon throws his much smaller force from one flank to another, striking in a whirlwind of small battles that together form a pattern of central position on a grand scale. At Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, Montereau, he appears first on one enemy flank and then another, breaking isolated corps, panicking cautious commanders, forcing them to pull back and regroup. For a time, the world sees again the terrifying efficiency of his movements, the way he can use interior lines to transform inferiority in numbers into local superiority. Only the sheer size and persistence of the coalition finally crushes him. Not a failure of the concept, but a failure of his dwindling means to sustain it. The central position is revolutionary because it treats the enemy coalition not as a single monolith, but as a series of separate organisms that can be isolated and beaten in sequence. Before Napoleon, many generals understood the value of dividing an enemy, but few were willing or able to commit their entire strategy to the idea that one could stand between multiple foes and strike each, while keeping the others at bay through speed and presence. He reduces the old aristocratic style of war, with its fixed positions and slow mutual maneuvers, to the level of prey and predator. Coalitions are no longer grand alliances of united armies. They are collections of victims who will fall one by one as they advance along divergent lines and are cut off from each other by the very man they seek to surround. Tied to this use of interior lines is another technique that magnifies its power, the rapid concentration of force. Napoleon lives in an age before radio, before mechanized transport, before long-range instant communication. Messages travel on horseback, soldiers march on their feet, artillery is hauled by horses and oxen. Yet despite these limitations, he achieves movements that seem almost unbelievable to his opponents. He does this by reorganizing the structure of his armies and by enforcing a culture of constant readiness to march. Under the old systems, an army is often a single, massive column, moving slowly, with all arms bound tightly together. If scouts spot an enemy force, the entire mass must slow, deploy, and prepare for battle. Napoleon transforms this model by creating core, intermediate formations large enough to fight on their own for a short time, with infantry, cavalry, and artillery all included. Each corps marches on separate parallel roads, spread out across the landscape like the fingers of a hand. They live off the land as much as possible, drawing supplies from requisition and local resources so that they do not need to rely on a single lumbering supply line for daily necessities. The distances between corps are carefully judged so that they are always within a day or two of one another, near enough to rush to each other's aid, but far enough apart to move quickly without clogging the roads. This dispersion allows the army to cover more ground and to respond more flexibly to intelligence about enemy movements. But the true magic appears when the moment comes to fight. Then the dispersed columns begin to converge. Orders fly out from headquarters, carried by galloping aides. Trumpets sound, drums beat. Each corps receives its route and its objective. They march, often through the night, guided by the conviction that at the other end of all this effort lies a decisive encounter. At the chosen point on the map, the fingers of the army close into a fist. Corps that were 50 or 60 miles apart when the orders were dispatched arrive within hours of each other, forming a line of battle that seems to have arisen from thin air. Austerlitz in 1805 is not only a triumph of deception and central position, it is a masterclass in rapid concentration. Napoleon has already knocked Austria out at Ulm. Now Russian and remaining Austrian forces under the Tsar and his allies gather in Moravia. The French army appears scattered along a broad front. Weather is harsh, supply is strained. To enemy eyes, Napoleon appears weaker than he is, his right wing in particular seemingly thin and vulnerable. This invites a coalition plan to turn that flank and crush it. But what the enemy sees is a picture drawn several days out of date, frozen in time by slow communications and incomplete reconnaissance. In reality, Napoleon has set his corps in motion with a precision that makes the entire region into his chessboard. As the coalition moves to attack where they think he is weak, his reserves are already marching to the threatened zone, his center poised for a sudden advance onto the critical heights. By the time the sun rises on the day of battle, his army is concentrated on a compact field, its divisions placed in depth, its artillery ready, its reserves positioned for the decisive counterstroke. The coalition has more men on paper, but those men are spread over a wider arc and poorly coordinated, while the French forces are gathered tightly around the key terrain. When the pressure is at its peak and the Allied center is drawn thin by their attack on his right, Napoleon unleashes his main assault into the gap, supported by troops who have arrived from long marches just in time. The enemy line collapses under the weight of this concentrated blow. A battle that might have been a grinding frontal struggle instead becomes a swift and catastrophic defeat for his foes. This pattern repeats, with variations, across many campaigns. In 1806, he marches into Prussia against a kingdom that has rested on the laurels of past glory and failed to adapt. Prussian mobilization is slow, their sense of timing dulled by years of peace. Napoleon marches his corps through the Thuringian forests in parallel streams screened by cavalry. He does not know exactly where the main Prussian army is at first, but because his corps are spread out yet mutually supporting, he can adjust as new information arrives. When he discovers that the enemy is concentrated near Jena and Auerstedt, he pulls his forces together with astonishing speed. Corps that had been days apart converge in a matter of marches, crossing rivers, climbing hills, pushing along narrow roads and through bottleneck villages. Prussian commanders, accustomed to slower tempo, are stunned to find French corps appearing from unexpected directions. What they thought was a single contingent turns out to be the leading edge of a much larger mass. By the time they fully grasp the scale of the threat, it is too late. Napoleon has assembled his army on the decisive sector and strikes with concentrated fire and shock, shattering the Prussian forces in a pair of battles that smash their military power in a single campaign. Rapid concentration is not just a matter of giving orders and demanding effort. It depends on a shared ethos. Officers and soldiers under Napoleon come to understand that long marches and sudden redeployments are part of their way of war. The infantry learn to live with blisters and exhaustion, the cavalry with sore horses ridden hard, the artillery train crews to move guns at speed, to repair broken carriages, to drag cannon over surprising terrain. Staff officers learn to calculate more precisely how long it will take for each corps to reach a given point, factoring in the conditions of the roads and the load of the troops. Napoleon himself spends hours over his maps, measuring with his fingers, converting distances into days and hours, thinking of his corps not as fixed numbers but as flowing streams that he can direct and then bring together in torrent. For the soldiers, these movements have a psychological impact that goes beyond fatigue. They march knowing that their speed is part of the plan, that the entire success of the army may depend on their reaching a village or river crossing before the enemy. They feel themselves being used not merely as bodies in a line, but as elements of a larger design. This builds pride and also tension. They know that when the march ends, battle is likely. They march through the night with the knowledge that at the end of the road there will be cannon and smoke and cries in the dawn. This idea of dispersing and then converging forces at the decisive point holds within it a third technique, one that is both subtle and devastating: the strategic use of dispersion and convergence as a way to confuse and trap the enemy. Napoleon does not always move his corps in obvious directions. He often spreads them over a broad front, so wide that the enemy cannot be sure where the main blow will fall. Some corps advance directly, others march along flanking roads, others linger in reserve behind a screen of light troops. To opposing commanders, the French deployment seems scattered. They must guess which of the several columns represents the true threat. If they spread their own forces to cover all options, they weaken their capacity to resist at any single point. If they concentrate too early against one column, they expose their flanks and communications to another. This uncertainty is deliberate. Napoleon wants his enemies to misjudge his intentions, to shift their troops in the wrong direction, to commit reserves too soon or too late. A clear illustration comes from the campaign of 1807 in Poland and East Prussia. The terrain is harsh, with forests, lakes, and poor roads. Winter brings mud and snow. Napoleon spreads his corps over a wide arc, probing, skirmishing, drawing the Russians into movement. His forces appear in multiple directions, some threatening one set of roads, others another. The Russians and their Prussian allies struggle to read his pattern. Their own communications are slower, their command structure more rigid. They seek a decisive battle, but they cannot force it on their own terms because they are never sure exactly where his mass will appear. When at last the armies clash at Eylau and Friedland, it is after a series of marches and countermarches in which Napoleon has used dispersion to stretch his opponents and convergence to assemble his army at the chosen place. The use of dispersion and convergence can also be seen in the famed march across the Alps toward Marengo in 1800. As first consul, Napoleon seeks to surprise the Austrians in northern Italy by crossing where they do not expect. He leads an army through the Great St. Bernard Pass, along paths that seem impassable to heavy guns. His forces are spread along difficult routes, some dealing with the enormous challenge of hauling artillery over snowbound tracks, others moving along lower routes and side valleys. The Austrians have their main attention focused elsewhere, thinking that the principal French forces are still far away. By the time they realize that a significant army has appeared behind them, it is too late. The dispersed French columns have converged into a coherent force on their flank and rear. Even though the Battle of Marengo itself is tactically unstable, with the French initially pushed back before reclaiming the field, the entire campaign shows how strategic dispersion and surprise crossings can be used to set up an operational convergence that alters the balance of power in a theater almost overnight. These three methods, central position, rapid concentration of force, and strategic dispersion and convergence, are deeply intertwined. Central position depends on the ability to move quickly along interior lines, to get from one enemy front to another before the coalition can unite. Rapid concentration depends on the ability to disperse corps for marching and supply, then gather them swiftly for battle. Strategic dispersion and convergence are made possible by confidence in the speed and reliability of movements, and by a willingness to show the enemy an apparently scattered front while knowing that the scattered elements can be snapped together abruptly. Together, they form a way of making war in which movement is the foundation and battle is the culmination rather than the whole story. For Napoleon's enemies, facing this style of warfare is like trying to grasp smoke that suddenly forms into stone. Reports arrive one day of French forces here, another day of French forces there. Scouts see columns on one road while peasants speak of other columns on another. The coalition generals know that Napoleon cannot be everywhere at once, yet the pattern of his movements makes it feel as though he is. When they try to concentrate their own forces, they find his army already between them. When they attempt to attack a wing that appears weak, they discover that reinforcements have marched through the night to support it. When they stretch their line to guard multiple fronts, he chooses a point where their line is thin and hurls a concentrated blow that breaks it. This psychological pressure is powerful. Commanders who have grown up in a more sedate operational culture are suddenly confronted with an opponent whose army can cover distances in days that they had previously planned for weeks. Their carefully arranged timetables collapse. Orders drafted in the morning are obsolete by evening. Retreats designed to buy time instead open gaps that the enemy surges through. Compounding this is the aura that builds around Napoleon himself. As news of his victory spreads, as story after story circulates about how his troops appeared where they were least expected and destroyed an isolated army, a sense of fatalism takes root in some of his adversaries. They do not simply fear his numbers, they fear his speed and his uncanny sense of timing. On the French side, These methods also leave a mark on the minds of soldiers and officers. To serve in the Grande Armée is to live in motion. Veterans recall endless marches, sudden changes of direction, the sound of messengers pounding up with new orders, the nights spent asleep by the roadside because time will not allow the luxury of finding billets. They experience their own version of the central position, not in abstract terms, but as the knowledge that they are often hitting part of a larger enemy, hoping that their comrades will deal with the rest. They taste the fruits of rapid concentration when they arrive exhausted at a battlefield and see other corps that they passed 2 days before, now assembled beside them, forming a line that stretches to the horizon. They feel the strange sensation of strategic dispersion when their own column moves through quiet country with no enemy in sight, only to be suddenly thrown into the furnace when the wider pattern of the campaign snaps shut around a chosen point. Terrain plays a crucial role in all of this. Napoleon studies maps constantly, but maps alone are not enough. He rides the ground when he can, sends engineers and staff officers forward to assess roads and crossings. He needs to know where rivers can be forded, where marshes might slow a column, where mountain passes narrow the path to a bottleneck. Central position is impossible without viable interior routes. Rapid concentration stalls if roads are too few or too bad. Strategic dispersion loses its edge if the enemy can see everything plainly from open plains. Thus, he often seeks theaters that favor his style of war, where rivers, hills, and road networks give him options that his enemies will not fully exploit. In the flat, open spaces of Russia, he finds a harsher stage, one that still allows wide maneuver, but with distances so enormous and supplies so fragile that even his methods cannot easily overcome them. There, his genius for movement is tested against extremes of weather and vastness that slow even the fastest marching corps. Time itself is both ally and enemy. Every maneuver, every use of central position and rapid concentration is ultimately a race. Napoleon must beat not only the marching speed of enemy columns, but also the slow adjustment of their minds. Each day that passes gives his opponents a chance to understand his intentions and react. Thus, he often prefers short, violent campaigns, where the initial shock of his movements disorganizes the coalition before it can adapt. In long wars, the enemy learns. Generals who survive an encounter with his methods study them, adjust their own deployments, stiffen their resolve. In the later campaigns, especially after the disaster in Russia, coalition armies begin to coordinate more carefully, to resist the urge to split up in pursuit of his forces, to maintain their own interior lines. They adopt a strategy of attrition, aiming less for single decisive battles and more for the gradual wearing down of his resources. They learn, painfully, not to be drawn too far out on a limb by feints and dispersed threats. Against such foes, even his greatest techniques cannot always bring forth the same shattering victories, yet they still cause fear and confusion whenever he can find a moment of weakness to exploit. The most dramatic final attempt to apply these ideas comes in the campaign of 1815, the fateful 100 Days. Released from his first exile, Napoleon returns to a Europe now ruled by monarchs who think they have buried his era forever. He moves with astonishing speed, seizing Paris, raising troops, re-establishing his rule in a matter of weeks. Facing him are the British-led army under Wellington in Belgium and the Prussian army under Blücher. Once again, the situation invites a central position. If he can place his army between these two foes, defeat one quickly, and then turn on the other before they can unite, he might yet change the course of history one more time. He advances rapidly into Belgium, catching the Allies before they are fully concentrated. At Ligny, he strikes the Prussians, using his locally superior numbers to drive them back in a violent battle. At Quatre Bras, he clashes with elements of Wellington's army, attempting to prevent their union with the Prussians. For a moment, it appears that the old pattern is re-emerging. He has forced the Prussians away to the east and held the British to the west. If he can now pivot and crush Wellington before Blücher recovers, he will stand in the central position once more, the master of the space between two enemies. Yet things do not unfold as in the past. Communication falters. Some of his marshals do not move as swiftly or decisively as the situation demands. The Prussians retreat, not away from the British, but in a direction that keeps open the possibility of returning to the field. Wellington, cautious and calculating, withdraws to a strong defensive ridge at Waterloo rather than allowing himself to be fixed in a weaker position. Napoleon still attempts rapid concentration, bringing his forces together against the British. He still tries to use dispersion and feints, sending forces to observe the Prussians while he focuses on Wellington. But the Allied commanders also understand the danger of being beaten in detail, and they cling to their own lines of communication and mutual support. On the day of Waterloo, the French army is concentrated, but not as overwhelmingly or as cleanly as in earlier masterpieces. The Prussians, moving through mud and confusion, still manage to march toward the sound of the guns, converging on the battlefield in time to tip the balance. The very methods that Napoleon has used for years now return against him in the form of enemy movements that preserve their coalition rather than allowing it to be shattered. When his attack fails and his last reserves are thrown back from the ridge, it is not only his army that is broken, it is the era in which his mastery of movement has dominated European war. Despite this final defeat, the legacy of his techniques endures. Military thinkers in the decades and centuries that follow study his campaigns obsessively. They analyze his marches, his choice of routes, his use of corps and interior lines. They see in his central position the archetype of a method that can allow a smaller force to defeat a larger one by sheer skill of maneuver. They see in his rapid concentration a lesson in organizational flexibility, in how to build an army that can both live dispersed and fight concentrated. They see in his strategic dispersion and convergence a warning about the power of deception and the danger of underestimating a force that appears scattered. In a later age of railways, telegraphs, and mechanized transport, some of his ideas find new expression. Trains make it possible to concentrate armies even more quickly at chosen points. The concept of interior lines becomes tied to rail networks and supply hubs. Armies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries design their mobilization plans around the idea of assembling along interior routes to strike at an enemy before he can fully deploy. The tragedy of the First World War shows that movement alone cannot always overcome the factors of mass, firepower, and entrenched positions. Yet even then, commanders dream of the decisive maneuver that will break the stalemate, inspired in part by the shadows of Napoleon's campaigns. In a world of modern technology, the physical hardships of his marches are hard to imagine. His soldiers trudged through snow and mud in shoes worn thin, slept in fields and barns, crossed rivers on makeshift bridges, climbed passes with cannon dragged by human and animal muscle. They marched often fueled by nothing more than coarse bread, a little meat, and the fire of belief in their general and their cause. Their reward was not only pay or promotion, but the intoxicating knowledge that they were part of a force that could move faster and strike harder than any army Europe had seen. They carried their own fear as well. Fear that the promised decisive battle would bring not glory but death. Fear that their general might miscalculate for once and leave them cut off between larger foes. Yet as long as the system worked, as long as central position and rapid concentration kept delivering victory, that fear was always mixed with pride. For his enemies, the memory of facing his movements is also indelible. Staff officers in Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and London pore over reports that speak of days in which French columns seemed to spring from the earth. They recall trying to guess where he would appear next, shifting their own forces like clumsy giants while he dances between them. They remember nights filled with anxious conferences, maps spread under candlelight, wet boots leaving prints on tent floors, the nagging realization that every hour lost in indecision might translate into miles gained by his corps. They remember messengers arriving out of breath with news that a supposedly distant French corps has already taken a nearby town, that a vital crossroads is already in his hands, that an isolated detachment is suddenly surrounded. Once the smoke of his era clears, what remains is the sense that Napoleon changed the grammar of war. Before him, battles were often seen as the central event, with maneuver merely the prelude. He reverses this relationship. For him, movement writes the first 3/4 of the story. When he can control movement, he writes the ending as well. He brings to life the idea that war is a contest of wills fought in the realms of time and space as much as in the exchange of fire. He shows that by exploiting interior lines, you can break a coalition that seems overwhelming, He demonstrates that by organizing an army into flexible, self-sufficient corps, you can move and then concentrate with unprecedented speed. He proves that by dispersing to confuse and then converging to strike, you can hold enemies in uncertainty until the moment your hand closes around them. In this way, the three legendary movement techniques associated with his name become more than just tricks of one gifted commander. They become enduring concepts. Central position teaches that geography and deployment can overcome disparities in size if used intelligently. Rapid concentration of force teaches that organization and discipline can turn separate marching columns into a single devastating instrument at the crucial moment. Strategic dispersion and convergence teach that deception and flexibility can multiply the effect of every battalion, every battery, every squadron. The image of Napoleon that lingers is often the one of him on horseback, gray coat and hat, staring down a valley toward the enemy. But behind that image lies another, quieter one. A man bent over maps in a dimly lit room, candles burning low, compasses and rulers scattered across the table. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. Inside, he moves his fingers along roads and rivers, murmuring distances, calculating days and hours. He sees in his mind the march of each corps, the confusion of each enemy commander, the arrival of reinforcements, the swelling of forces at a single chosen field. He is not yet thinking of where the cannon will be placed or how the infantry will form their lines. He is thinking first of how to get them all there, together, at the right moment, while the enemy is still scattered and uncertain. It is there, in that quiet moment before dawn, in the invisible decisions about roads and timings, that his true revolution lies. From Italy to Germany, from the plains of Poland to the fields of Belgium, his armies redraw the relationship between movement and battle. His central positions slice coalitions apart. His rapid concentrations turn scattered corps into unstoppable storms. His strategic dispersions and convergences keep enemies guessing until the last second. Long after the guns of his time fall silent, generals and historians will still trace those marches, measure those distances, and feel, in the careful study of his campaigns, the pulse of a mind that understood movement not as something separate from battle, but as the very heart of victory.